Thanks, everybody. Thank you for being here again, as Jean said earlier this morning. Just to make you aware, we actually have 14 licensed cultivators in the house this morning. 14 licensed cultivators from all across Southern Africa. We have license holders from the Western Cape. We have license holders from KZN. We have license holders from Lesotho and from Northwest Province. Over and above that, as far as exhibitors and suppliers concerned, we have the exhibitors, which John will mention again later, but we have local representatives of agencies across South Africa. We also have representation, people who've traveled from Greece, from the Netherlands, and from the USA to join us for the summit today. So I think it's good to take notice of the reach and the effort that people have taken to get here for the summit for today and tomorrow. So thank you to all of you for that. All right, this next session is a Q&A with 4 laboratories, licensed laboratories that are operational in South Africa. I don't really know how to kick this off because I think we all know the importance of analytical laboratory services in our country and across the world. I mean, a quick story, back in the day, I used to work for Canopy Growth Corporation when they were a thing, and we were bringing CBD isolate encapsulated from the US. And we actually washed that isolate 4 times to try to get the THC count down. And then we sent it to 4 different laboratories across the USA. And each laboratory in the USA gave us a different result on CBD isolate in terms of potency. So I guess the kickoff is, we think we have issues with analytics potentially, or, we like to complain maybe sometimes about services. But it's a global phenomenon that, each lab has its own sense of practice and standards to a degree. And this session is really just to meet the key people behind 4 of the analytical laboratories in South Africa. And what I'd like to do is just briefly mention who's part of the panel. On the screen, you'll see Hanli Smit from VinLabs. Hanli is currently in the Netherlands for business, but has kindly made the time to join us remotely from there. So Hanli, thank you for joining us. To my left, I have Peter Mopelo from M&L Laboratories in Johannesburg, which is part of the Bureau Veritas Group. To his left, I have Brenda Marks from Cure Laboratories, based in Montague in the Western Cape. And then we have from Somerset West, from Eco Green Analytics, Greg Ondrakovic. I got it right. Thank you so much. Okay. So I could do an injustice of introducing each person's laboratory, but I'm actually going to let them do it themselves because they'll do a much better job of it. So I'm going to start off with Hanli. And Hanli, if you don't mind, give us an introduction to VinLabs, a quick introduction, then we'll pass over to Peter. Thanks, Hanli.
Hello. VinLabs started 22 years ago. I think my passion is service, and we try to combine that with our field of science, and started as a wine laboratory, and after that we also expanded to do different, like water and micro, and cannabis just came on the right time.
Thank you, Hanli. I'm going to hand over to Peter now. Peter, if you give us a quick introduction to M&L Laboratories, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Peter Mopelo. I'm the sales manager for an analytical laboratory by the name of M&L Laboratory. We are wholly owned by a multi-international organization by the name of Bureau Veritas, which was founded in the year 1828, and M&L was founded in 1930. We were then acquired by Bureau Veritas in the year 2010. So we offer analytical services on a wide range of services. And yes, thanks a lot. I hope you could hear me.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Brenda. I represent Cure Laboratory. We're out on the other side of the mountain in the beautiful little town of Montague. I started Cure Lab back actually before cannabis, the industry was born in South Africa, and well, it was still in its infancy. I was making all sorts of oils and extracts for friends and family to help them with sleep and pain and things like that. Very, very private, very, very hush-hush. This was not legal yet. And then my dog got cancer, and I put him on a cannabis dosage of an oil that I made myself, and it cured him. And I wanted to know, being an analytical chemist myself, what I was giving him. And this was such invaluable information. I wanted to share it with the world. But because cannabis was not legal at that stage, I didn't know where I could have it tested. And I managed to get money out of my house bond, and I bought a very, very tiny little basic gas chromatograph that I ran out of our spare room in our house. And that is where Cure started. And then I teamed up with Jean and Chris, who are also here, and Nati and his wife Ilse. And everybody with a bit of a background in cannabis, each from their different backgrounds. Chris is a microbiologist, geneticist, biologist. Jean is a healer. Nat is a grower. And we all just came together and brought our strengths together, and we started Cure out in the beautiful town of Montague. And as the industry came into fruition, we also decided we're going to move with it, and we got our SAPRA license, and we're looking forward to building good relationships with the rest of you guys in this industry.
Thanks, Brenda. And just lastly, Greg, to give us an introduction. Thank you.
Thanks. As Greg said, I'm Greg Andrejkovic. I'm the owner and technical director of EcoGreen Analytics. We're based in Somerset West. Our company was founded in December 2020. I was getting so many requests because, look, at that point, I wasn't working for my own company. I was working for a company called Element Materials Technology, which mainly did environmental analysis, especially for the petroleum industry and land remediation. I was getting so many requests to have cannabis tested, and obviously being a global conglomerate, Element wanted nothing to do with it. I was also being given COAs even from the States, and saying it's impossible what they're seeing. So I recognized the gap. I managed to procure an HPLC, and very similarly, we were running off our dining room table until we moved into the premises that we're in now. And we also received our SAPRA license last year in October. So we are fully licensed.
Thanks, Greg. Okay, so what we did is we put out a request to the main members of the association, being licensed cultivators, to put forward questions they would like the labs to be asked. We took a selection of those, and we will work through them now. There will be an opportunity later if you do want to ask your own questions at the end of the session. But I'm going to ask Hanley the first question. Basically, after my random intro about the different lab results in America, is standardization among cannabis testing labs possible, firstly? And why, to put into two questions, why is there a difference in results between laboratories in South Africa per se? Hanley, thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a combination with your second question, or one of your other questions that also referred to whether we test the sample on dry base and on wet base. The labs don't standardize at the moment to analyze on dry and wet base. That will have quite an influence because a wet base analysis is basically a screenshot or analysis for that moment on the sample. And every sample every batch can differ according to its moisture content through a period of time. So I think on our side, we would say we must sort of standardize whether we're going to incorporate moisture. It will help to give more consequent results. And then, everyone, I suppose we all strive to work towards the German pharmacopoeia. And if we all use the German pharmacopoeia or work towards that, we should all get the same results. We have different equipment, so there is fine-tuning involved. Some of us do the cannabinoids with GC and other with HPLC. There's also different HPLCs on the market. But I think the German pharmacopoeia, one must basically verify their results against the German pharmacopoeia, and it should be fine.
Thank you, Hanley. Who else would like to add to that?
A big question is, if you're working with an isolate, how can your results differ? So my question to you is, how far were they from each other? What was the difference? Do you know?
You know what, it was 4 years ago, which feels like 40 years in the cannabis industry. So I wouldn't be able to say I'd be making it up. I can't remember, but I do remember them to be quite far apart. So we're talking, again, I'd be guessing, but it's in the 90s, obviously being an isolate percentage.
Yeah.
And it was quite a surprising difference.
So if you were looking at, say, some labs that gives you a 60% result versus a 90% result, that is significant. But if they're all around plus minus 10% of that 90, I mean, there are so many uncertainties in the processes that we follow. Every balance has an uncertainty. Every reference material that you buy, I mean, all of us use certified reference materials, but all of them also have tiny little uncertainties in their exact purity. And we use that to quantify the analytes against those certified reference materials. So you need to also keep in mind that no analytical result is absolutely exact. We all validate our methods to be within certain acceptance criteria. So we all work with margins of error and margins of accuracy, tolerance levels, and things like that. So you're never going to get an absolutely exact result. As Hanley said, the moisture content does play a role, especially with flower. If they are not packaged in sealed containers where the water cannot come in and out. I mean, where I am in Montague, the air is dry. Out here, it might be a rainy day. The moisture does affect the results as well. Also, plant homogeneity. We all know the plants are not homogeneous. You can harvest flower from the same plant, just from different positions in the plant. You will get slightly different results. So all of these things you need to take into account. Then you have a huge harvest of 900 and something plants. They were grown in this end of the grow room, that end of the grow room. Did they all get exactly the same oxygen? Did they all get exactly the same CO2? Did they get exactly the same light? Did they get exactly the same nutrients? All these things play a role. Flower position relative to the light, leaves covering, all these things play a role. So how can you perfectly say that this tiny little flower sample that you took from this half a ton batch represents the whole batch? So you need to allow certain tolerances. And I know in America there are certain states that allow tolerances up to 25% plus or minus whatever the label claims, which is massive. Colorado, I think, works on a 15% tolerance. So that already plays a role, and it shows you that you cannot have an absolutely exact result. However, with concentrates and isolates, you do expect smaller margins.
Now, I hear you, Brenda. So just jump in there for a sec. I think let's keep the conversation on flower. I understand your reference to isolate for this for the licensed cultivators, but it's a true point. And I think, in my opinion, as farmer to farmer, for analytics, you have a sample from the farmer. You don't know where it came from. Right? It's up to the licensed cultivator to have their own SOP when it comes to representative samples from that harvest. So the farmer must have a consistent standard way of taking the samples. And now I'm preaching to the converted here, but that's not your responsibility. So you take what you get and you provide analysis. You've got a clear process to follow, you all do, and that is what you put out at the end of the day.
Yes, we as Cure, and I know VinLab also does that, is we send samples to other labs on a fairly regular basis, just to compare our results with the other labs. But now you must also take that homogeneity into account. So what we try and do is homogenize our sample as well as we can before we send it out, because it doesn't help you take a single flower and you send that to 3 or 4 different labs, because you can't guarantee that those flowers are going to even have the same results. So you need to have homogeneity, and you need to, as you said, try and sample as representatively of your batch as possible.
Because what happens if you don't is that those samples or the flower then gets sent overseas to global markets. They're then tested in their market, and they follow their standard procedure of representative sample, and they get a very different result, which doesn't end in a long-term relationship with that licensed importer. So very important, as you said. Who else would like to add anything about standardization?
So an important part of any operating laboratory, especially under the ISO standard, or if you try to adhere to the ISO standard, is proficiency testing. So proficiency testing can consist of inter-laboratory comparison. I am doing an inter-laboratory comparison with a colleague of mine, but he doesn't run a contract laboratory. He's got his own in-house QC lab at his grow facility. Then proficiency testing. This is now a sample that's ordered in. It's a certified reference material of matrix. So we've performed two flower rounds and 1 oil round in the last year. So how it works is we order in this sample from a proficiency testing provider. We don't know what the value is. We do the analysis, we send our results back to them, and then they score us. You get something called a Z score. Anything between -2 and above 2, below 2 and above -2 is a pass. Obviously, every laboratory would love to get a score of 0 because then you're spot on. And we've done exceptionally well in all 3 rounds of proficiency testing we've done. So proficiency testing is really, really important.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to pass the question on to Peter. In terms of the terpene testing profiles, we get requests, being a sales service agency for the industry. Certain buyers, say in Australia, request a minimum of, let's say, 2% terpene content as an overall content on the COA. Now, the question we have is, do we have the capacity or ability to test for all the terpenes in this country? And again, do we even know what all the terpenes are? So to that question, Peter, in terms of M&L Labs, what is your capacity or ability to test for terpenes, and how do you fulfill that service for your clients?
From the update that I usually get from the technical and operational team, they do have the capacity, but it's obviously they've been doing a lot of development, making sure that what they try to detect is correct, and obviously the limits. On the side of M&L and Bureau Veritas, I don't think the capacity is an issue, but I obviously do agree with the previous question. It's mostly on making sure that there's a correct benchmark and there's a correct formality amongst all the labs, and also ensuring that there's a lot of engagement with where the product needs to go. Obviously, in the pharmaceutical side, there is what we call analytical method transfer, where you share ideas with the guys that are receiving the product and how they want it to be analyzed. And once your analysts are competent and deemed competent, then you're sure that you're capable of doing it.
That's great. I always say, people ask, well, what flower should we grow, or how much what terpene percentage should the flower have? And we always say, look, take the client specification first, look at the national requirements in terms of a TGO 903 from Australia, and then put that into formulation for a lab like M&L. Who else would like to add on the terpene side, please?
So at present, EcoGreen Analytics is analyzing for 23 terpenes, most commonly found in cannabis.
So is that 23?
23. So I have been seeing levels of 2% and up. I've even seen a couple of about 3.2, 3.6, which is great for the clients and great for the buyer. So I use a technique called gas chromatography with mass spec detection. So at any given time in my run, my detector is busy scanning over a certain mass range, as well as performing targeted scanning for each terpene that I've told the detector to look for. But in the greater picture of things, once the run is complete, I'll just integrate everything on there. And I'm seeing a lot more than the 23 terpenes that I'm analyzing for and identifying them. I just can't quantify at the moment because we don't have the reference material. But there is a 65 terpene reference standard on its way, which we should have in about a month.
So just quickly on that, so for the cultivators' benefit, the main members here, what does it take to secure that reference material, and what do you need to do to make sure you can offer a broader range of terpene testing?
Well, step one is to get the reference material in. It's not very difficult. It's just a little bit pricey. We're looking at about 20,000 Rand for a mill. Then it's obviously further expanding the method. And then once I'm happy with it, then we can offer the 65 terpene analysis. And then obviously the more terpenes you're looking at, the higher the total percentage of terpenes would be.
Yeah, and I think that's part of if I can call it the intention, is to be competitive with the likes of Canada, where you typically see Canadian flower being generally above 2% terpenes. And the way I look at it, more from a schoolboy analysis point of view, is that it seems like they're testing for more terpenes as a generalization. Hanli, would you like to add to that?
I think all the labs would like to test as much as possible terpenes. We have standards, but there is a validation process, and we focus on what was the most important at the beginning. Validation is important. I think it would be nice to know, or actually to expand according to priority, to see what is relevant and then expand towards it. But I do think all of the labs would like to expand on that. It's just baby steps.
No, exactly. Reza, a very good point there, Hanli, that we are still in a nascent startup industry. I know we all want to run and sprint and drive Ferraris, but I think we've got a while to go before we get there yet. And Brenda, do you want to add anything on the terpene side?
I think everybody's covered it pretty well. The main terpenes that we would expect are the alpha and beta pinene, caryophyllene, myrcene. They will contribute the biggest components, the biggest percentage of your total terpenes content. So you can look at all the little grasses there. They will add up and they will contribute to the total terpenes. But in the end, the main cannabinoids will still give the greatest contribution. But ideally, one would like to identify all of them and get the full picture.
Yeah, no, understood. So just to touch on international referencing of results, and I'm going to give this to Greg as a question. So what we find again as farmer to farmer is we receive a COA from one of these laboratories. We send it across to Australia, to Israel, or to Germany. I'll give you an Israeli example. We send a sample across. The COA in South Africa is 21%. Gets to Ben Gurion Airport. It goes to the Bachtuchem laboratory at the airport. It's 21%. And it goes to 2 other labs after that, and they come out as 27 and 28% in Israel, which is above the limit, 24.67 for Israel for THE perspective. So from where I come from, it's very important to be able to validate laboratories' results in the market of destination, or where the flower is going to go to. And we have done it with 1 or 2 laboratories to great success. We're talking 1 to 2% variance at one of the labs in Australia compared to a South African lab, which is good news for all of us. But have any of you had experience of this in terms of cross-referencing your lab results with an international lab, whether it's Germany, Israel, Switzerland, UK, or Australia? I'm missing a few, obviously.
We haven't actively compared with other laboratories overseas and in other countries. What I have had was feedback from customers where they had their samples tested at overseas labs, and our results have been very comparable. Greg, you've done proficiency testing. Were those samples from overseas or local?
The proficiency testing samples came from the States. I think they're in Charlotte, North Carolina or something. And that's obviously a prepared hemp sample that's been spiked. Then the same, it's the same for me from what Brenda said, is that our clients have said once it reaches the other side, our results are very comparable. But we have been in talks with the laboratory in Israel, and we're just trying to get the logistics together of how to swap samples so that we can do inter-laboratory comparison. It just comes from a permit point of view. We obviously have to apply for an import permit. They need to apply for an export permit. So, but it's in the plans to be.
Thank you, Peter. From your M&L Laboratories is wholly owned by Bureau Veritas. Bureau Veritas is an international group that doesn't just do cannabis; it does multiple different industries. It's a massive group, the way I see it. What cross-referencing or international standards have you guys set as a group?
Obviously, BV globally doesn't really get involved in medicinal cannabis. So MNL is the only lab in the group that's handling medicinal cannabis. So we do have customers that we deal with or that we test for obviously their exports. And the feedback that I have received through those customers and the operational team is that the result has been comparable and they're aligned with the product at destination. I believe Germany is one of the countries that some of the customers do export to, and those results has been acceptable.
All right, we're going to move along in terms of, Hanley touched on it earlier about, there's a question, and I'm seeing some cultivators reporting a dry-based THE percentage on the COAs or the spec sheets compared to a wet content or LOD. How do we see this going forward as analytical services? Do we see room for both, or is it, are you just doing what you're required from your clients? Maybe Brenda, you want to answer this one?
Okay, so you do a loss on drying determination. As Hanley said previously, the moisture content of your flower does influence your ultimate result. So to take out of the equation the influence of moisture is you determine how much water is present, and you can then do a calculation on what the cannabinoid content on the dry base is. Then once you have that value, then based on the actual moisture content wherever you are in the world, you can work out what the cannabinoid content will be. Say whether your moisture content is 10% or 13%. It will slightly affect your results. So if you know what the cannabinoid content on the dry base is, that's sort of your benchmark. It doesn't mean that your customer is now buying, say, the cannabinoid content on dry base is 25, and it will be about 22 as is. So now you cannot sell the cannabis on a 25% dry base because that's not the product that gets out there. So you must realize that, okay, so as is, the lab reports the result as they receive the sample, regardless of what the moisture content is, and then with the LOD information, you work out what the cannabinoid content is on the dry base, and so you can basically work out and compare apples to apples, really.
Yeah, I've seen some clients actually request me to do that, but as a rule, I don't really do it. It's just because that's how my method was validated. Then what I have seen is, depending on the method of moisture content, if you put it in an oven at 105 overnight, you're going to get between a 15 and 18% moisture content. Then you factor that into your cannabinoids, it's going to greatly increase that percentage. Whereas I know a lab in Australia is doing it in a desiccator at 40 degrees under vacuum, and they were getting levels of like 3.8 to 4.2%. We're also busy developing the method according to the new proposed EU monograph on cannabis flower with molecular sieve under desiccator under vacuum at 40 degrees. But it's still in validation stage at the moment.
I think what they also have learned, what the pharmacopoeias have learned, is that this moisture content determination needs to be standardized. So in the old days, as Greg said, your oven method overnight, 105 degrees, is what generally was the standard for any botanicals. And now the Europeans have caught on, and they've decided, okay, no, we want to standardize, and we would rather do a moisture determination using the vacuum oven method. And it's all, as we have said previously, it's all about standardizing and just making sure that everybody compares the same thing to the same thing. The oven method, where you get rid of all the volatiles, you don't only get rid of moisture, as in water, but you also get rid of other volatiles like your terpenes and other volatile plant components. So as long as you know what you're comparing with what, any method makes sense. But so the LOD is a loss on drying. It's not a moisture content. One must just distinguish between the two different methods of drying and what you're reporting accordingly.
Exactly, and that's based on client requests at the end of the day, because it does get fairly complex, different methods, and you just stipulate which method to use for the testing.
Yeah, so when a client does request, I do put a bold statement on my COAs to say that the cannabinoid content has been adjusted to compensate for moisture, just so that if it does get to the other side and they analyze it as is and say, hey, wait a minute, look at this, then at least the statement is there.
Okay, another question given to us by the main members of the association. Hanley, I'm going to pass this one to you. How do the labs discard all the cannabis waste after testing?
It's official PCL, which is a company that do medical waste. And because of the potency or the active ingredients in cannabis, you need to destroy the active ingredients. And you can add detergents, or you can add ethanol, but do the extraction so that when the flowers are discarded, that no one can sell it or use it.
Yeah, I'm sure we're all going to concur with that. Anything else to add on that? It's a pretty straightforward question.
Pretty straightforward. You get companies that specialize in waste management, and they give you a certificate that they responsibly disposed of it. They usually incinerate the pharmaceutical waste, so there's absolutely nothing. It doesn't get dumped somewhere in in the black market or anything like that. It gets completely destroyed.
Okay, Greg, I'm going to pass a question to you, and this again comes from the cultivators, not from me. But why is testing so costly in South Africa? How do we get to work out a costing that seems to be fair across the market?
Okay, well, I can't speak for the other laboratories, but when it comes to us...
I'll let you get their turn, Dory.
When it comes to us, whether we're running one sample or a batch of 20 samples, which is our full batch, where there's also quality controls involved that we need to run. There's consumables involved. Solvents get put down the drain, running through the HPLC. There's salaries that need to be paid, overheads. So we're trying to keep it as market related as possible, or we run 20 samples, we run blanks, we run quality controls and duplicates. So your one sample is actually the running cost of 5 samples.
You must also keep in mind the price of the equipment. Depending on your technology that you're using, can cost you anything from $1 million to 12 million for an instrument. That instrument needs to be maintained. That instrument uses electricity. That instrument needs an operator. The operator needs to be qualified. The operator needs to be compensated for their work. You can't just get any monkey in to do the work. because you're dealing with people's results there, and it's sophisticated equipment. They need to understand what they're doing. They need to understand what they're working with. That person needs to be paid. And now you haven't looked at your consumables or overheads or anything like that. So we are not taking that money that you're paying us for our tests and putting it straight in our pockets, I can tell you that.
Peter, would you like to add to that as well?
Now, that's an interesting question to, I guess, the entire industry, from food to pharmaceutical and medicinal cannabis. So as labs, I must say I'm in sales, so I have this conversation with customers every time there's an annual increase. There's a lot of challenges that labs do experience. One, just Brenda just mentioned, those technical expertise, the guys that you don't normally see that are in the lab. We need to secure and maintain those expertise. We need to remunerate them appropriately according to the industry norm, and operating the lab as well, more especially if you run things like your stability. So you cannot run with a load shedding schedule. Your lab needs to run 24/7. So apart from us paying the national grid on a monthly basis, we need to make sure that we pay for diesel. We need to make sure that we maintain those generators. So there's quite a lot of things that the labs are really experiencing on a daily basis for us to be able to make sure that we produce the results that are supposed to be sent to you. So there's a lot that we need to maintain.
What I haven't mentioned is the maintenance of the equipment. Depending on the type of equipment, a single service for an instrument can be in the area of 40,000 Rand, and that you need to do every year on every instrument. So those costs all need to be compensated for.
Understood. Hanley, would you like to add to that in terms of how do you determine what is fair costing in the analytics space?
I just want to add, they've touched on most, but also the qualification of the equipment, the moment that they've serviced, or even if the service provider touched your instrument and changed something, you need to qualify again. So there's costs involved on that side. And then we need to record everything working according to GMP. So a lot of time going into just recording what you do and writing. So it's unfortunately not the same as it would be with a non-GMP analysis. And you always get only one time to do it right. So you put a lot of effort and you can't really repeat. You must, from the first time, you must do it right. So like with stability testing, we do 3 times every analysis from the start. And we charge for one, but we make sure.
Thank you, Hanley. Actually, Greg and I had an interesting chat earlier. It's around ISO standards, which is becoming more important and prevalent in the industry. And Greg, may you just touch on in terms of what people need to understand in terms of your client base is the responsibility that comes with testing product on behalf of people. So maybe you can just refresh my memory and just share with people, when you become ISO certified as a laboratory, what does it mean in terms of responsibility, particularly for the analysts even themselves?
Okay, well, I'd first like to differentiate between SARPA license and ISO accreditation. SARPA license licenses your facility to deal with scheduled substances and to analyze scheduled substances. So our license is comprised of we're allowed to test. That's it. But now my whole facility is covered by the license. When it comes to ISO, ISO is very method specific. So I will validate my potency, go through all the checks and balances. Once I'm happy with my validation, I'll apply for accreditation for that method. And it will only be for that method, and it will only be for cannabis. So I can run a potency on an isolate, but I'm not accredited for it. So you cannot pass those results off as accredited. So what we have seen is there are labs that are accredited that are doing cannabis, and they're sort of implying that they're accredited to do cannabis when they're not. They're accredited to run pH in water or something like that, you know. So from a safety point of view, it's not really a safety point of view. It's just if you're accredited, you're working to an international standard. And that's recognized globally. And
so the second point is about the responsibility of the analyst in terms of once you're ISO accredited, how long are they responsible, accountable for results?
So once you have your method accredited, there's a technical signatory associated with that. And that technical signatory, once they've put their signature on that COA, they're responsible for it for up to 10 years and need to stand by those results in court. I've heard of it happening to colleagues. hadn't worked for a facility for 9 years, and they got called to court because it was land remediation involved, and millions and millions goes into land remediation. And so somewhere there was a discrepancy, and he got called to court, and he said, well, I stand by my results. I was the technical signatory at that time. So that's how seriously accreditation should be taken.
Hanli, would you like to add anything on the ISO side?
Well, ISO 17025 basically make you international recognized. We all use the same standard internationally, so it would be the same as for our clients to say you've got EU GMP. It would be that the standard that we use for ISO, whether it's in South Africa or anywhere in the world, it's the same. So that, I would say, that is why it's a gold mark. But yes, there's another audit coming, and there's different responsibilities, totally different from GMP. So it complements each other. It makes it.
Yeah, thank you, Hanli.
Can I also
Sure, please go
come in?
Brenda.
Sorry. So also ISO is more of a management system. So it shows when you have ISO accreditation, it focuses, as Greg said, on this specific method. But it also shows that your laboratory has a system where everything is managed and everything is traceable back to the origin of the world. So you can really trust an accredited result. And yeah, but also remember, as Greg said, if somebody is accredited for pH measurement, it doesn't mean they're accredited for microbiological testing or cannabinoid profiling or anything like that. It is specific to that method. But what is good about having an ISO accreditation is those systems are in place, and if a lab has the system in place for one method, you would hope that they would have that system in place for other methods as well, even though they're not accredited. But you cannot claim accreditation if that method has not been audited by ISO and certified to be accredited.
Okay, I was going to come back to one question we haven't touched on fully, but it's around why do THC percentages vary from lab to lab in South Africa? And Brenda's already mentioned that the plant is not homogeneous. Every bud on the plant will have a slightly different at least active content results. But let's just dive into it a little bit more, if you don't mind, please, just in terms of how do we find some way of having some kind of standard, or is it impossible?
You can try and get it as close to the truth as possible. That is what I think all of us try to do. So when we receive a sample, we would try and homogenize that sample that we got as well as possible, and then take the sample that you need for preparation to do the THC analysis on that.
Just tell us how you do that quickly, just a quick, how you make it homogeneous.
Okay, so I would grind it up. What also works very well is if you have a frozen sample, to just smash it and mix it. Grinding works well. And it's all just about getting, you want the particles to be of similar size as much as possible, so that you can get a homogeneous mix, and you take something out of that mix. This sample aliquot that you need to do for that sample, because you don't use the whole sample on any of the tests. You just take a tiny little bit. So now also keep in mind, the grower has kilograms of plant material. They take a 100-gram sample out for testing, and the lab goes and they split that sample into all the tests that they need to do and take a little bit out of each. So it's very, very important to try and work with what we've got and homogenize that as possible, because then at least that's the best you can do, really.
Yeah, so homogeneity is very important, as Brenda said. So our procedure normally is we ask for micro samples to be packaged separately, so that there's no room for any possible cross-contamination in sub-sampling. But the rest of the sample will homogenize the whole thing, and then subsample for the different analysis from there. Then when it comes to calibrating the instruments for a certain method, let's say delta 9 THC. The commercially available standards at the moment, I think the highest concentration that any lab can get at the moment is 1,000 parts per million, which is 0.1%. Now we're dealing with flour that's between 18 and 28%. So a dilution will have to be made to bring it into calibration range on your final extract. So if an operator or a lab tech is maybe in a little bit of a hurry and they've got to take let's say 50 microliters of the extract and dilute it down, one tiny drop more or one tiny drop less has a huge impact on the end result. So that could be a factor that, I mean, it happens. And that's why we run random duplicates. And if we see anything is wrong with that duplicate, we repeat the whole batch before releasing anything.
So just again, that's n equals 2, right? You double check all your results.
Yes.
As a standard
when
process.
I say duplicate, we actually, in a batch of 20 or even in a batch of 1, we'll run a sample in duplicate, but just a random one. And then that's fully prepared from extraction all the way into a vial and ran on the instrument. If we see any discrepancy in that duplicate, we'll obviously check our quality controls, our blanks. Did something happen during the analytical run? But if that duplicate fails or if any of the quality controls fail, we'll repeat the whole batch.
Okay, thank you. Hanley, would you like to add to that in terms of why do THE percentages vary across labs, and is there any way of actually trying to standardize that, or is it fairly impossible?
I think they've touched to most, and when it comes to COA, luckily we get enough samples. We do often get one flower to test, and those samples you will never be able to compare. So I think if the clients can just take that in mind always. But I think to homogenize your samples and standards and not expired standards, but they've touched on most of it.
Okay, thank you. So last question that came in a little bit earlier today is just around, it's a contentious thing, not really, but you get a couple of handheld devices in the industry, right? You get a Gemma Search, you get a Purple Pro, I see there's a new one on the market soon. Some cultivators believe they can use that as like an not an in-process lab, but a testing system. How accurate, in your opinion, are these Gemma Certs and Purple Pros, and do they add value? And obviously, we all know why we use laboratories, but how fair reference are these devices in your opinion? I'm going to start with Greg because he's smiling.
This has been a bit of an issue. We've done a lot of comparative testing with GemmaCert and Purple Pro, and we've seen on average the GemmaCerts and the Purple Pros are producing results which are about 5% to 8% higher than the value that I'm reporting. So where I think this comes from is the GemmaCert was designed for the coffee shops in Amsterdam. The higher your THC content, the more you can charge for it. As an indicating tool as to when to harvest, it's a nice to have. But you can't really trust that nominal value. It still needs to be tested in an analytical laboratory.
But if it says, sorry, but before you take over, if the Purple Pro GemmaCert says 20% versus 8%, is that a fair indicator that the farmer's got something decent here or not so decent in terms of making a call during growing the product?
Obviously, as the plant is busy growing, it's producing THC. So periodically just monitor and monitor and monitor and monitor. The value might not be exactly what you want, but at least you'll get an indication and sort of like a graph as to where your peak time to harvest would be, depending on what your end usage is. Then from there, once the harvest has been done, send it to the laboratories for analysis, just to confirm what the actual content is.
Okay, I'd like to come in on the different technologies. So those handheld devices are near infrared. So they literally just scan the outside of what they're seeing, and it's all about, so the near infrared light is shone into the sample, and what reflects is what it reads. That reading is then compared to a database that's somewhere on the cloud, and then the result is reported. So it's more a predictive model than an actual reading that it's taking. Where this is the lab test, we take your sample, we extract what's in it, we compare it to certified reference materials right there. It's not compared to a database of anything. So it's a much more direct comparison, the lab test versus the NRR that is compared to a database. And some of those near-infrared machines, they're not maintained, and the databases are not maintained. And you can always expect drift from any instrument. So that's why you need to keep those reference materials. You need to keep calibrating. You need to always have to have your checks and regularly check that there's no drift, and that you keep referring to the certified reference material and not to a database that's just it's not anchored to anything specific. But as Greg said, it's a great little tool to have on hand if you scan your grow, monitor your growing, and compare your different cultivars with each other or different growing methods with each other. As long as you know you're comparing like with like, and then once you've made your final decision what you want to take out, send it to the lab and get a more accurate result.
Thank you. Hanli, would you like to add anything to that?
Also think it's good for trending. The repeatability on those instruments are not that great, and I think it's important for the clients to know that. We will sometimes do the same sample 5 times. And you might get it 20, or 20, and then you might get it 18, and you might get it 16%. So, and then at last it will stabilize. But you can't just do one reading and think that is your reading. So that's just something that they can take into account.
No, thank you, Hanli. So that comes to the end of the questions that I've been given to ask. I'm sure there must be people here who've got questions to ask or subjects they want to raise around analytics. Who'd like to ask the first question?
Thank you, panel. That was great. I have 3 questions and a comment. My first question is: do you keep retention samples, or do you rely solely on each site to keep their retention samples, which is a regulatory requirement?
So we keep retention samples for up to 2 months after testing, in case there are any queries or requests or retests needed. But after that, the integrity of the sample does become questionable, so you can't keep it forever. With the pharmaceutical industry, my experience, they keep the samples retained, but this is the manufacturer. They keep retention samples for their own records. If they get a customer complaint, they need to. So it is also the grower's responsibility to keep retention samples of their own products. So we keep retention samples to cover our backs, but every manufacturer, grower, producer need to also keep their retention samples to cover their own backs for whatever might go wrong along the way.
So it's a regulatory requirement to keep a retention sample for 5 years. I was just interested to know how long you keep yours for. So that was just the question, and then it sort of feeds into what you were saying about the integrity of the sample, that it leaves here at maybe 22 THC and it arrives somewhere else, but the degradation of that sample, it might not have been dried enough, so you are going to get that differential. So it speaks to a much bigger picture, but I'm not going to get into that now. I just wanted to say. Then my second comment was on the cost of lab testing. Often why we get that question is that the reference standard costs aren't taken into account. So not to highlight it, but that was one of the things that the reference standards are very expensive to buy in. And my question following from that comment is, do you foresee South Africa being able to make and develop their own reference standards to bring down those costs?
That would be phenomenal if somebody can do that. So Jackie, if there's business opportunity for you.
Yeah, it's in the masters.
So if you can do that, that would be absolutely fantastic.
Okay.
And I can't say that it's impossible, because if you can ensure traceability back to NIST, then it will be good enough. Then we can do it.
It's a good opportunity for South African strains in terms of reference standards. And then my last question was, in terms of homogenizing your product, do you take into account and do you tell your clients that they must ensure that whoever's doing the testing on the buyer or the offtake side is using the same methodology, because your results are going to be different if the same methods are not applied? And that is often, I know it really sounds basic, but often the basics are overlooked. Do you tell your clients to check that their offtakes are using the same methodology, or do you just
do you mean like testing methodology? Yes. Or sampling methodology or sample
Both.
prep? The chances that 2 different labs are going to use completely identical methods is very, very slim, because everybody optimizes their methods in-house. Even though you use guidelines from the pharmacopoeias, you need to optimize that works on your type of instrumentation. Even chromatographic columns, like a C18 is not a C18. They're not identical. Yeah, exactly. So every lab, and every lab who knows what they're doing will optimize and tweak their methods to be as good as they can possibly be. And that is why I think it's quite nice that we use different types of instruments and we do compare amongst each other, that we still get similar results. Because in the end, it's not really your measurement that determines how good your result is. It's the whole thing. It's the sampling, it's your extraction, it's your sample prep, it's your instrument calibration. All those things play a role. It's not only the end measurement. So that good enough.
So I'm very rude. I think when people ask a question, if they can just introduce themselves and say where they're from, please. So I'm Greg Beadle. I didn't introduce myself, but I think you all know me. That was Jackie Ramage. Davi, you had a question there.
Davi Raskol, Medicinal Cannabis. I want to propose maybe the SANCAP members can get more value for our membership fees and maybe some value added, and ask that the labs participate in a proficiency testing and like Jackie mentioned, maybe reference samples and get into a standardized testing around thing to just to see where we are all at, and so that we standardize our procedures, our sampling procedures, our testing procedures, our LOD methods, determination, etc. And I think that's must then be available to SANCAP members if we are involved in maybe helping to fund this or run this project.
Thanks for that comment, Davi. And I think Joanne has been trying to work on that as well. But I think it's a great drive for the labs. We obviously in the same industry, we are business partners. And if all the labs are in the same line and within the same association and following the same principle, I don't see anything wrong with that. I mean, it just create visibility and transparency amongst all the lab. So yeah, I fully agree and we appreciate your recommendation.
My name is Nick Abbing from cannabisdrying.com. First I have a couple remarks, then I will ask a question. There has been said that the outside conditions have a lot of influence on the moisture content of the product or the loss on drying of the product. But we have visited a couple facilities more on the other side of the country, and they're drying a lot with outside air. I would advise to dry with inside circulation, so outside conditions doesn't influence your moisture content. And I also wanted to say that with our system you can get very exact in your moisture content, so it will all be 10-11%. And if at least your moisture content is homogeneous, your job will get a lot easier. And then I had a question for the lady in the middle. You said an interesting statement that loss on drying is something different as the moisture content, which I agree on because you lose more than the moisture content. But then how do you calculate the moisture content if your loss on drying is not the moisture content?
So the European Pharmacopoeia has now published the monograph on cannabis, and they have suggested this vacuum method where they specify the vacuum on your vacuum chamber at 40 degrees, and you leave that, 24 hours? So that is to standardize. However, you can't guarantee that is only water and only moisture. So I would say ultimately, if you want to just know the water content, you would have to go and develop a method on a Carl Fisher titrator to get an exact water count.
Okay. I know that method you were just talking about, 40 degrees, 24 hours, is also the validated method in the Netherlands. I don't know if you know the company Bright Labs, which is like the biggest lab in the Netherlands, but they use that method as well.
Yeah, so that is now the European pharmacopoeial method. Right. That's a standardized one, yeah.
All right, thank you.
Where are we on stability testing in South Africa?
Okay, before you answer that, I think it's a very important question why people understand we need stability testing. I'm sure all licensed cultivators know why, but for those who don't, particularly in Australia and Germany, obviously, Germany is more tricky because my understanding has been EU GMP accredited stability study. But for Australia, you have to back up your label claim. So, for example, we pack flour at our facility in Gauteng and we send it to Australia with a certain expiry date on that label. The first person who opens that container is the patient at the end of the day. And they expect that patient to last for the 12 months that's on that label claim date. So Jackie's question is around where we're at with stability. Do we offer stability testing? And maybe we can give a quick overview of stability at the different standards in terms of accelerated stability and real-time stability, and what capacities that are available, if at all, from the various labs. Peter, do you want to take that question initially?
Yes, sir, I can. So our lab currently is able to offer stability. I don't have the actual conditions with me, whether the relative humidity and the percentage, the degree, but we definitely can offer stability. There are some customers that we're currently doing stability storage and testing for them. It's always a challenge based on how the product is packaged, and if you look at the size of the chamber. So ideally, I would want to also do storage, but the business doesn't allow just to store. So we do store and test the very same batches. So we do have the fairly good capabilities. We've just commissioned another chamber this year, so we are there. But obviously, the more the demand, the better the business can bring in more stability. It differs on the requirements, but some goes, I think it's between 12 to 24 months.
Yeah, we've seen, also what you need to bear in mind, as Peter touched on, is that you need to test each different strain or varietal in the packaging that it's going to be packed in that goes on the pharmacy shelf. So you can test for a 10-gram bag, you can test for a 200-gram bag, for a kilogram bag, but you can't use the same results across different size packaging or different strains. So it is key to understand. So when it comes to testing samples, you need to run your tests across the different, depending what you're going to test. Sorry, Brenda, you're going to take over here, just what you're going to test and how many intervals you're going to test and how much sample size you need for stability.
So, yeah, stability is huge in the pharmaceutical industry specifically. So you need to show that your product is stable in the packaging that is going to go to the customer. You need to show that your product, if it's being transported in bulk, that it is stable in the bulk packaging. Stability, generally, the conditions are for the room temperature is 25 degrees, 60% humidity. For the accelerated, it's 40 degrees, 75% humidity. So what happens is if you want to submit your product for registration, you need to show at least 3 months of accelerated stability, which would then theoretically translate to what the product would look like over a 2-year shelf life. So you need to test the product at certain intervals. Usually the intervals are initial, which is fresh, 0 months, then 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months. And if you want to give it a longer shelf life, you need to test it annually after that as well. And how much sample you need to be able to do a full panel testing. Okay, not 100% full, because once you've tested for heavy metals and pesticides, that's not going to increase during the life of your product. But things like microbial growth, you definitely need to monitor. Your cannabinoid and your terpene degradation, you need to monitor that. So those are the tests that you want to test at every test. Yeah, I think that's as much as I want to say. You want to add something?
Hanley, would you like to add anything on the stability side?
I just would like to add that stability testing is a very expensive exercise, and the client needs to plan exactly and to know what they want and where they're heading to. It is expensive, and once you start, you want to complete. You don't want to go way into the process and then realize you actually need different packaging, or your THC was not exactly what you wanted, or something like that. You need to plan.
Yeah, and
work accordingly.
Exactly. Exactly. It's an investment and something that needs to be done. And there are cultivators here who have stability at least 12 months and as well as accelerated results. And credit to them for getting on early and making sure they're compliant with those requirements. So make sure you introduce yourselves, please. Spread the love, and we'll see you after lunch. Thank you.